The Fraser Valley lies in the early morning under a layer of fog that sits low and flat against the river, the water below it moving but invisible, the sound of it muted by the cold. Above the fog, the old-growth cedar rises, columns of bark so thick and furrowed they seem less like trees than like something older, something that belongs to a category of thing that has no good name in English. The canopy closes high overhead. The forest floor beneath it is quiet the way old forests are quiet, which is not silent but layered, the drip of water from branch to branch, the small adjustments of birds in the dark before light comes, the sound of the land settling into another day. The sensuous people have moved through this landscape for a very long time. Their territory runs through the lower Fraser Canyon, where the river narrows between the mountains and the valley opens out, the forest thick on both banks, the water running fast and cold. The word Sasquatch comes from them, or close enough, through the kind of phonetic translation that early settlers and anthropologists made of Hulkamelum words, that the origin is not in doubt. What the word names is not in doubt either, at least among the Sensuous. It names a creature that has lived in these forests alongside them across generations of oral tradition, a creature understood not simply as a large unknown animal, but as a being with spiritual significance, something capable of moving between the physical world and a world that runs alongside it, present and not quite present at the same time. This is not a detail added for depth. It is the actual content of the tradition, the thing the Slates have maintained and passed on, and in recent decades chosen to share carefully in forums where it can sit alongside Western research without being reduced by it. The Sasquatch Summit, which the Sasquatch Nation has hosted in their territory, brings together indigenous knowledge holders and researchers, and the purpose of it is not to settle any question, but to allow different ways of understanding the same creature to exist in the same room. An elder standing at the edge of the Fraser Valley forest, where the tree line meets the river mist, where the green canopy runs unbroken as far as the ridgeline allows, carries knowledge of this being that is not the same kind of knowledge as a plaster cast or a length measurement. It is older. It was arrived at differently, and it has persisted through every kind of change that has moved through this valley without losing its essential character. There is something worth sitting with in that, not the question of whether the creature is real in the way a measured, documented animal is real, but the simpler fact that a community of people has maintained a coherent, detailed, spiritually integrated account of it across centuries, and that the account has not drifted or softened or become decorative in the way that stories sometimes do when they are kept only as stories. Among the Scienceadales, the Sasquatch remains a live concern. The forest at the edge of the valley remains a place where ordinary things and extraordinary things are understood to share the same ground. The Lummi Nation of northwestern Washington, whose territory lies along the coast near what is now Bellingham, carries a related but distinct tradition. The figure in their oral record is called the Tsimaquays, a name that carries in its sound something of the creature's character, heavy and slightly guttural, the kind of name that settles into the mouth rather than lifting out of it. The Tsimaquays is described as large, covered in hair, and carrying a powerful, unpleasant smell, details that early anthropologists documented when they began collecting and transcribing the oral traditions of Pacific Northwest peoples in the early decades of the 20th century. What the anthropologists found when they compared accounts across different peoples and different territories was a consistency that was difficult to explain as borrowing or imitation. The details aligned without the accounts having been coordinated. The creature that appeared in Lummi tradition and the creature that appeared in Stanziel's tradition were recognizably the same kind of being, described from different places by people whose contact with one another was not sufficient to account for the similarity. Anthropologists have treated this consistency carefully. It is not evidence of a creature in the biological sense, but it is evidence of something, a long-term cultural awareness of an anomalous figure maintained across tribal boundaries, stable enough across time that the description did not blur into generality. That Tzemeckis is not a vague wild man. The Lumi description is specific. The size, the smell, the hair, the way the creature moves through the forest. These are the kinds of details that drift out of stories over time if there is no continuous experience to keep them sharp. The fact that they have not drifted is itself something to note quietly, without making too much of it. In 1884, the Victoria Daily Colonist published an account that represented something different from oral tradition, an account that entered the record through print, which meant it could be dated, copied, and returned to. The story appeared in the June 25th edition. It described the capture of a creature near Yale, British Columbia, a small settlement in the Fraser Canyon, not far from Sinclair's territory, a coincidence of geography that is at least interesting. The creature was reportedly captured by the crew of a train that had stopped unexpectedly along the line. It was described as resembling a gorilla, standing approximately 4 feet 7 inches tall, covered in glossy black hair about an inch long, and possessing a body that was otherwise human in its proportions. The article gave the creature a name. It called it Jacko. A copy of The Colonist spread open on a wooden table shows something about what the account was, a newspaper column surrounded by the ordinary news of 1884, the livestock prices and shipping schedules and small municipal notices that make up the texture of a place going about its business. Jacko appears in that context, not as a sensation, but as a curiosity, the way colonial-era papers sometimes reported strange animals or unusual events, with a matter-of-fact tone that assumed the reader would accept strange things without requiring drama. The print is slightly smudged, the column slightly crooked, the way type looks when it was set by hand and then pressed into paper that was not quite flat. The account was not widely followed up. Later researchers were unable to locate subsequent reports of Jacko's fate, and the story has remained one of those things in the record that cannot be confirmed further, but also cannot be cleanly dismissed, sitting in its particular year and place like a question that has simply not been answered. The creature described, the size, the hair, the ape-like appearance, does not match the Sasquatch of later reports in every particular. Jacko, at 4 feet 7 inches, is smaller than what most accounts describe. Researchers have suggested various explanations: a juvenile animal, a misidentified known species, a hoax, a genuine report that was embellished in transit from source to page. None of these explanations has been established firmly enough to close the question. What remains is the account itself, specific in its details, appearing in print at a time when the word Bigfoot had not yet been invented, and the idea of a large unknown primate in the Pacific Northwest had not yet consolidated into a cultural phenomenon. In 1884, it was just a thing that had been found near Yale, British Columbia, and the newspaper had thought it worth reporting. By the summer of 1924, something of a different character was happening in the mountains of Washington state. Fred Beck was a prospector. He and a small group of companions had a cabin near Mount St. Helens, in a remote section of the Cascades that required considerable effort to reach. They had been working claims in the area, doing the ordinary work of prospectors, moving through steep terrain, managing equipment, sleeping in a small structure far from any town. What Beck and his companions reported began before the incident that gave the location its name. They had seen large footprints in the area. They had heard sounds they could not explain. The forest around their cabin had felt, in the way that forests sometimes feel, like it contained something more than what they could see. On the night of July 12th, Beck later wrote, large ape-like creatures attacked their cabin. They threw rocks. They crossed the roof. The prospectors could hear the weight of them above the ceiling boards, the sound of something very large moving against the wood in the dark. A lantern burned low inside while the men waited, the light small and steady against whatever was happening outside and above. The attack, as Beck described it, lasted through much of the night. In the morning, when the sounds had stopped, the men left. The canyon where this happened was subsequently named Ape Canyon, a name it still carries on maps of the area, which is now part of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Beck was not a man given to public claims for most of his life. He did not immediately write about what had happened. It was 1967 before he published an account, a book called I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens, and by that time he was in his 70s, looking back at an event that had been 43 years in the past. The passage of time does not validate or invalidate what he described. It simply means that the account, when it entered the written record, came with the patience of someone who had lived with the memory for a long time before deciding to put it down in words. What the book describes is consistent with what the canyon was named for: the geography, the timeline, the details of the cabin, and the men, and the night they spent in it. The place itself has continued to be a location where unusual things are reported, and where the forest is dense enough, and the terrain remote enough, that the question of what might move through it at night is not one that resolves simply. Albert Ostman's account is the oldest of the named encounter stories that have been examined closely by researchers, and in some ways the most specific. Ostman was a Swedish-Canadian prospector who described an event he said took place in the summer of 1924, the same summer as the Ape Canyon incident, though the two events were geographically far apart and the two men apparently did not know each other. Ostman's account, when it eventually came out, reached the public through researcher John Green, who interviewed him in 1957. Ostman was by then an old man. He said he had kept the story to himself for 33 years because he did not think anyone would believe him, and because he had made a promise, to himself or to the circumstances, that he would hold it privately. What changed his mind is not entirely clear. What he told Green, and what he swore to in a signed statement, was this: he had been camped near Toba Inlet on the coast of British Columbia, prospecting in the area, sleeping rough in the way prospectors did. One night, he was picked up in his sleeping bag, still inside it, still half asleep, and carried for a distance he estimated at several hours. By the time the movement stopped and he was set down and could get his bearings, he was in a valley he did not recognize, surrounded on all sides by steep rock walls, with no obvious road out that he could see immediately. The account that follows is detailed in the way that invented stories sometimes are, but also in the way that remembered experience sometimes is, full of the kind of specific, small, slightly incongruous detail that does not have an obvious purpose in the telling, but stays in memory because it was part of what happened. Ostman described 4 Sasquatch, an adult male and an adult female, a young male and a young female. He described their behavior over approximately 6 days. The way the adult male watched him with what seemed like curiosity, the way the young male was interested in his gear and tried to examine things, the way the adult female was indifferent to him in the manner of someone who has more important things to attend to. He described what they ate, how they moved, the the sounds they made. He described the valley itself, the plant life, the water source, the way the light changed through the day between the walls of rock. The question of what to do with this account is one that researchers have approached differently. Some have treated the detail as evidence of authenticity, the argument being that the specificity of the domestic description, the social dynamics, the ordinary behavior of four individuals going about their lives in a valley is not the kind of thing a fabricated account tends to produce. A fabricated account tends toward the dramatic and the simple. Ostman's account is neither. Other researchers have noted that the account was not public for 33 years, that it cannot be corroborated, and that the delay itself raises questions about how memory might work across 3 decades. Both of these observations are fair. Neither of them settles the matter. What the account offers, whatever its ultimate status, is something that the more famous later evidence does not quite provide. It is a portrait of the creature in its ordinary life, not a creature crossing a road or moving through the frame of a camera. A family. 4 individuals with recognizable social structure, the old male asserting authority, the young male curious and slightly reckless, the female focused on practical matters, the young female watching from a distance. Ostman described watching them from the edge of the clearing over several days, close enough to observe, but far enough that nothing was required of him. He found, as the days went on, that he was less frightened than he had been. The strangeness held itself at a distance. The creatures went about their lives. He went about the small business of staying calm and thinking about how to leave. When he did leave, he used the adult male's distraction. The creature had taken Ostman's snuff box and apparently swallowed some of the contents, which did not agree with it, to move quickly to a part of the valley where he had identified a possible route out. He did not look back, he said. He got out by following the terrain upward and eventually reached country he recognized and made his way back to civilization. He did not tell anyone what had happened for 33 years. The account reaches the researcher through layers: memory, time, the process of being written down by someone else, the translation of spoken testimony into a signed statement. Somewhere inside those layers is whatever actually happened to Albert Ostman in the summer of 1924, and that thing, whatever it was, is not recoverable in any clean form. What is recoverable is the account as he gave it, and the account has a quality that distinguishes it from most of the encounters that came later in the public record. It is domestic, it is slow, it is interested in the social life of the creatures more than in any single moment of confrontation or alarm. The oldest stories are sometimes the most particular. Among the Stanzids, where the tradition is not a story, but a living framework for understanding the world, the Sasquatch is described not as a monster or a mystery, but as a kind of being that has its own nature, its own relationship to the land, its own way of moving between the visible and the invisible. The elders who hold this knowledge do not tend to describe encounters in the language of shock or disbelief. The creature is part of the landscape. It has always been part of the landscape. The Fraser Valley fog lying low over the river in the morning, the cedar rising above it, the forest continuing in every direction beyond what can be seen. These are not the backdrop for something unusual. They are simply the place where everything lives, including things that are rarely seen. Ostman's Valley, with its rock walls and its clear water and its family of 4 Sasquatch going about their daily business, the young male investigating the human's pack, the old male watching from a comfortable distance, the female gathering food near the tree line, with the efficiency of someone who does this every day, has a quality of ordinariness that is, in its own way, the strangest thing about the account. Not strange as in alarming, strange as in unexpected. The creature that has been described for centuries in the oral traditions of the Pacific Northwest, the creature that has been named and remembered and integrated into a complex spiritual understanding of how the world is organized, appears in Ostman's telling as something that eats and watches and rests and attends to its young, and does not, fundamentally, seem to find anything particularly remarkable about the small human sitting at the edge of their clearing, waiting for his chance to leave. The young female watched from a distance. The old male settled eventually, still watching. The valley held the morning light between its walls of rock, and Ostman sat with his thoughts in a place no map showed, looking at a family of beings that the people of the Fraser Canyon had been describing for generations, and finding that the description, in its essentials, was not so different from what he was seeing. The specific detail of it, the social structure, the routine, the indifference of the female, and the curiosity of the young male, the authority of the old one, expressed not through action, but through presence, is the thing that has made the account persist in the serious literature of the subject, not the drama of the abduction, which is the part of the story that tends to attract attention first. The drama fades into context. What remains is the description of four individuals living their ordinary lives in a valley in British Columbia in the summer of 1924, observed by a man who had no language ready for what he was seeing, and no one waiting at home who would believe him if he tried to explain. The rain that falls in the Fraser Valley falls on the same old-growth canopy it has always fallen on, or close enough, the same species of cedar, the same depth of root, the same relationship between the water and the forest that has held for a very long time. The river below the fog is the same river. The territory the Storensols have named and understood and passed knowledge of across generations is the same territory. The creature that belongs to that territory, that moves through it, that crosses between the visible and the invisible, in the way the Storensols have described, is not something that began when the newspapers took notice of it, or when a prospector showed up with a camera, or when the word Bigfoot appeared in an American newspaper for the first time. It was already old by then. The stories were already old, and what the oldest stories have in common with Ostman's account, separated though they are by culture and language, and the particular form that knowledge takes in different contexts, is that they describe the creature not as a visitation, but as a resident, something that lives here, something that has always lived here, something that the fog at the edge of the river and the silence of the old-growth forest accommodate without difficulty, the way places accommodate everything that belongs to them, whether or not it is often seen. A flat, wide footprint pressed into the mud of a riverbank in British Columbia holds water in its deepest impression, the heel, which is broad and rounded, deeper than the toes, which are splayed slightly in the way of something that walks barefoot across uneven ground for its entire life. The rain is just beginning to collect there, a small lens of water gathering at the lowest point of the print. The forest around it is quiet. Whatever made it has moved on, back into the trees, or along the river, or somewhere the fog covers, and the light does not yet reach. The print will fill with water and soften and eventually become part of the riverbank again, indistinguishable from the ground around it. It was there, and in the tradition of the people who have lived beside this river for a very long time, the thing that made it has a name and a nature and a place in the world that does not require a newspaper to confirm it. The account Ostman gave in 1957, remembered across 33 years of silence, ends quietly. The creatures were there. He watched them. He left when he could, and what he carried back with him out of the valley and into the rest of his life was not a story he could easily tell, but a set of images specific enough to describe in detail decades later. The young male examining his pack, the old female moving along the tree line, the family at the edge of the clearing, going about their lives in the ordinary way of things that have no reason to suppose they are being watched, moving quietly together as the light of the valley changed around them. The road-building equipment at Bluff Creek had been sitting idle since the end of the previous workday. It was early in the morning, August of 1958, and the soft ground around the machinery, ground that had been churned and graded and left bare by the work of clearing a new logging road through the Six Rivers National Forest, was printed with a series of large flat-footed impressions that none of the arriving crew could immediately account for. The tracks were humanoid in shape. They were also, by any reasonable measure, enormous. Jerry Crew was among the first to see them that morning. He walked the line of the prints, stepping alongside them rather than in them, following the trail of impressions as it moved through the disturbed earth around the equipment and continued into the surrounding timber. Each track was somewhere in the range of 16 inches from heel to toe. The stride between them was longer than any man's. Crew had worked in these woods long enough to know what a bear print looked like and what a man's boot looked like, and what he was looking at did not match either. He noted the depth of the impressions. Whatever had made them had weight behind it, and he noted the consistency of the shape from one print to the next. The same broad heel, the same wide forefoot, repeated across the site in a pattern that suggested something moving with purpose rather than wandering. Crew went home that evening and built a wooden frame. He mixed plaster and poured it into one of the best preserved prints, and the following morning he had a cast. It was a solid, detailed thing, nearly as long as his forearm. He brought it to the Humboldt Times, the local newspaper serving the county seat of Eureka, and a reporter named Andrew Gonzoli wrote up the find. Gonzoli used a word that Crew had apparently used himself, a word drawn from the obvious physical fact of the thing in question: Bigfoot. It appeared in print in a newspaper in a way that readers across Northern California could pick up and hold in their hands. Before that, August morning, the creature described by indigenous communities across the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia had circulated under a variety of names. After it, there was one name that stuck. The Humboldt Times ran a photograph of Crew standing outside holding the cast. The image was picked up by wire services and ran in papers across the country. For many people reading those papers, it was the first time the question had been put to them in concrete form. Something large had walked through a forest in Northern California. It left a cast that a man was now holding up for a photographer, and no one who had seen it in person had a ready explanation for it. The cast was real. The prints had been witnessed by multiple workers at the site on more than one morning. What had made them was not established. In the years that followed, Bluff Creek remained a place where unusual things were reported. Workers, hunters, and hikers described large figures moving in the timber along the creek's canyon walls. Tracks continued to be found at irregular intervals. Researchers who had begun taking a serious interest in the question made their way to the area, collected what they could, and kept records. The road that had first exposed the soft ground where Crew found his prints was extended further into the forest over the following years, opening up more of the drainage to occasional human traffic without bringing it anything close to fully accessible. And then, in October of 1967, two men arrived at Bluff Creek with horses and a 16mm camera, and they found something. Roger Patterson had been interested in the question of the large unknown creature of the Pacific Northwest for several years by the time he and Bob Gimlin rode into the Bluff Creek area that fall. He had written about it, corresponded with researchers, and traveled to areas where sightings had been reported. He carried the camera as a matter of course. He had brought it specifically because he believed, or at least hoped, that the creek drainage might produce something worth filming. On October 20th, the two men were riding along the creek when their horses suddenly shied. Patterson's horse went down. He freed himself from the stirrups, pulled the camera from his saddlebag, and ran. What he filmed in the following 59.5 seconds has been examined more thoroughly than almost any other piece of amateur footage ever produced. The figure in the film is large, upright, and covered in dark hair. It moves away from the camera along a sandbar at the edge of the creek, walking on two legs with a stride that researchers have spent decades analyzing. At one point, it turns its head and looks back. It does not stop. It does not run. It continues into the tree line at the far end of the sandbar and disappears. Patterson later estimated the figure's height at between 6.5 and 7 feet. The footage he returned with was shot on color film and showed the figure's proportions, its gait, and the movement of its musculature clearly enough that the question of what it depicted could not be dismissed with a glance. Gimlin had remained on horseback during the filming. He had his rifle. He watched the figure until it was gone. In the years following the encounter, both men described the same sequence of events in consistent terms. The horses shying, Patterson going down, the brief sprint toward the figure, the film running, and Gimlin, who has spoken publicly about the experience at intervals across more than 5 decades, has maintained throughout that what he observed at Bluff Creek that afternoon was not a human being in a costume. He has said this calmly and without escalation, in the manner of someone reporting a thing they saw, rather than arguing a case. The experience, as he has described it, was not dramatic in the way a dramatic story is shaped. It was brief, and it was clear, and then it was over, and the figure was gone into the trees. The film itself has been subjected to analysis that is, at this point, quite extensive. Biomechanical researchers have examined the gait of the figure and noted features that would be difficult for a human actor to replicate: the degree of flexion at the knee during the walking cycle, the movement of what appear to be large gluteal muscles under the hair, the lack of any observable seam or structural disruption in the surface of the body covering. Photographic analysts have worked with the original frames to extract whatever dimensional information the footage can yield, arriving at height and mass estimates that vary depending on methodology, but generally cluster in a range consistent with what Patterson reported. No analysis has produced a definitive determination of fabrication, and none has produced a definitive determination of authenticity. The film sits where it has always sat, as a piece of evidence that has not been resolved, and that has not gone away. 12 years before Patterson and Gimlin were at Bluff Creek, a man named William Rowe had an experience in the mountains of British Columbia that he later committed to a sworn affidavit. Rowe was an experienced outdoorsman. He had spent years working and traveling through the forests and ranges of Western Canada, and he was, by his own account, someone comfortable in remote country and accustomed to observing wildlife at close range. In October of 1955, he was on a trail near Mika Mountain in British Columbia when he noticed, at a distance he estimated at between 75 and 100 feet, a large figure crouched beside a bush. He stopped. He watched. The figure was pulling leaves from the bush with one hand and eating them. Its movements were unhurried. Rowe described it as standing when it rose at roughly 6 feet tall and weighing perhaps 300 pounds, with a body covered in dark brown and silver-tipped hair. The head was proportioned differently from a human head, larger, with a flat forehead and a pronounced brow, and the face which it turned in his direction at one point was dark-skinned and expressionless. Rowe had his rifle. He considered shooting it. He decided, as he later described, that he could not bring himself to do it, that whatever the creature was, it moved with something that he could only interpret as personhood. He watched it for several minutes. When it became aware of him, it did not charge or flee in panic. It stood, looked at him, and then walked into the forest with a long, fluid stride that he noted was entirely unlike a human walking gait. He heard it make a low sound as it disappeared. Then it was gone. What Rowe did afterward was characteristic of the kind of witness whose account tends to attract sustained research interest. He told very few people about it at the time. He filed it away as something he had seen and could not account for, and he returned to his ordinary life. It was not until several years later, after the question of the large unknown creature had attracted enough public attention that researchers were actively seeking witnesses, that he came forward with a written account and subsequently agreed to provide a sworn affidavit to John Green, one of the most thorough early researchers in the field. The affidavit form was Green's way of creating a documentary record that would be more durable than an interview transcript, a formal statement signed under oath from a witness who had no obvious reason to fabricate the account and nothing apparent to gain from it. Rowe's description was consistent in its central physical details with other accounts from the region and the period. The dark hair, the height significantly greater than a tall man, the flat-footed, fluid gait, the odor which Rowe also noted, and the quality of the observation itself, unhurried, clear, conducted in daylight by a person who was paying attention and who had the composure to stay still and watch rather than retreat immediately, made it one of the accounts that researchers returned to repeatedly over the following decades. 14 years before Rowe's encounter near Mica Mountain, and roughly 400 miles to the southwest, a woman named Jeannie Chapman was at home in the small settlement of Ruby Creek in British Columbia when she saw something approaching from the direction of the riverbank. It was September of 1941. Her children were outside, and the creature she saw was very large. She would later describe it as over 8 feet tall, covered in hair, and walking upright, and it was moving toward the property with a directness that prompted her to gather her children and leave without delay. The family walked several miles to the nearest neighboring home. The account of what she observed was taken seriously enough by the people who knew her that a group of men, including her husband George Chapman and the local postmaster, went back to the property to investigate. What they found around the outbuildings was a series of large humanoid footprints, measured by those present at approximately 16 inches in length, and they followed them to a storage shed. Inside the shed, a large barrel of saltfish had been overturned. The contents were on the floor. The tracks led away from the shed toward the river and continued, as far as they could be followed, into the brush along the bank. Whatever had been at the property had not caused structural damage, had not harmed anyone, and was, by the time the men arrived, gone. The fish barrel was the main evidence of its visit. What makes the Ruby Creek account durable in the research literature is not any single element, but the combination of several: a witness whose character was vouched for by neighbors and community members, secondary witnesses who independently confirmed the physical evidence, a measurement of the footprints that matched dimensions reported in other accounts from different regions, and the mundane, animal quality of the behavior involved: a large creature, apparently attracted by the smell of stored food, investigating a shed and then departing. There is nothing in the account that is structurally implausible if the existence of the creature is granted, and there is very little in it that lends itself to easy fabrication. The footprints were seen by multiple people. The overturned barrel was a physical fact, and the witness had no apparent motivation to construct an elaborate fiction at cost to herself and her family. Sighting accounts, taken individually, always carry the limitation that individual testimony is fallible. A single witness, no matter how credible, is still a single point of data. What researchers in this field have worked to document over the decades is not any single account, but the pattern that emerges across accounts, the degree to which separated witnesses, with no contact with each other, return similar physical descriptions from different landscapes and different decades. The Ruby Creek account from 1941 and the Mica Mountain account from 1955 and the Bluff Creek prints from 1958 and the film from 1967 are not the same event. They are separate observations from different times and places. What connects them is the consistency of what they describe. That consistency and what to make of it is something researchers have been working on for a long time. Among the things they have collected and preserved, alongside sworn affidavits and photographic records, are physical impressions left in the ground, casts of footprints, and in at least one case, something considerably larger and more detailed than a footprint. In September of the year 2000, a team from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization was working in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State, an area of dense second-growth forest in the southern Cascades with a history of reported sightings running back several decades. The team was using a trail camera array and other remote monitoring equipment to document wildlife activity in a section of the forest where unusual sounds and prints had been reported. And on one of their survey walks through the area, they came across something in a muddy elk wallow. An elk wallow is a shallow depression in soft ground, typically used by elk and deer for rolling and cooling during the warmer months. The one in the Gifford-Pinchot that September was roughly the right size and shape for an elk, which is to say it was large enough for an animal of several hundred pounds to lie down in comfortably. But the impression in the mud was not an elk impression. The researchers who examined it identified what appeared to be the lateral side of a foot, a heel at one end, and what appeared to be a forearm impression extending diagonally, with a shape consistent with a creature of very large size having lain down in the wallow on its side. The team poured plaster. The resulting cast became known as the Skookum cast, named for the Skookum Meadows area where it was found, and it measured roughly 3.5 feet by 5 feet in its largest dimensions. Primatologist Dr. Grover Krantz examined it and concluded that the anatomical features it preserved, the heel shape, the forearm impression, the overall proportional relationship between the parts, were not consistent with any known North American animal and were consistent with a large primate of a kind not cataloged in the scientific literature. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, whose own work on track evidence spanned more than a decade at that point, reached a similar conclusion after examining the cast. The heel, in particular, was a focus of their analysis. It showed a shape and a proportional width that they argued could not be mapped onto a known species. The Skookum cast generated debate from the moment it became publicly known. Critics argued that elk, deer, or bear could have produced the impression through ordinary wallowing behavior, with different body parts leaving marks that together resembled something larger and more coherent than any individual impression warranted. Proponents countered that the anatomical specificity of the heel impression and the spatial relationship between the various marks in the mud was too internally consistent to be dismissed as coincidental overlap. The debate has not been resolved. The cast still exists, preserved in the condition in which it was poured, and researchers on both sides of the question continue to refer to it as evidence for their respective positions. That pattern, a piece of physical evidence that is detailed enough to be interesting, ambiguous enough to remain unresolved, and durable enough to outlast the argument over it, is characteristic of the physical evidence in this field taken broadly. Plaster casts do not decay. Photographs do not change. A sworn affidavit remains as precise as it was the day it was signed, regardless of what happens afterward to the people involved or the landscape where the observation was made. The affidavit that William Rose signed in 1957 is still in the research record. The plaster cast that Jerry Crew made in August of 1958 was photographed and documented before it eventually crumbled with age. The film that Roger Patterson shot on October 20th, 1967, was transferred to more durable formats and continues to circulate. The Skookum cast sits in storage at a facility in Washington state, labeled and cataloged, and Bob Gimlin, who was on horseback at Bluff Creek when Patterson ran toward the figure with his camera, has continued over the decades to answer questions about what he saw that afternoon, in the same quiet and consistent terms he has always used. What the accumulated record of these accounts offers is not a proof of anything. The individual accounts do not validate each other in any strict evidentiary sense. An eyewitness report from Ruby Creek in 1941 does not corroborate a film from Bluff Creek in 1967 in the way that two independent laboratory measurements of the same sample might corroborate each other. But the record does have a kind of texture that is difficult to dismiss entirely. It is made up of specific people, in specific places, at specific times, describing specific things with a level of detail that is hard to produce through imagination alone. Rowe watching the creature pull leaves from a bush with one hand, Chapman's children being gathered and walked miles down a road, Patterson's horse going down, and the scramble for the camera, and the figure turning to look back without stopping. The details are the thing. They accumulate quietly, one account at a time, across decades and latitudes, from logged-over mountains in California and old-growth drainages in British Columbia and forested river corridors in the Cascades of Washington. They do not add up to a consensus. They do not resolve into a finding. They simply continue to arrive, one observation at a time, each one logged and dated and held. The Skookum cast was removed from the wallow on a plywood sheet, transported out of the forest in the back of a research vehicle, and eventually set in a research facility where it has rested ever since. The heel impression at one end is clearly visible. The forearm depression extends diagonally across the center of the cast. The whole thing still carries, when described by researchers who have worked with it, a faint suggestion of the animal weight that pressed it into the mud, the scale of the thing implied by the dimensions, the quiet of a forest at night, something large enough to have settled comfortably into a wallow and left behind. In the morning, a shape in the ground that no one has yet been able to fully account for. The water in the Skookum Creek drainage ran the same way after the researchers left as it had before they arrived. The Elk Wallow, once the cast was taken, was just a depression in the mud again, filling slowly with leaf debris and rain. Whatever had been there was long gone into the trees, and the cast, sealed in plaster and labeled with its coordinates and date, preserved the impression of its absence, the hollow where something had rested, the shape of a heel pressed into soft ground, the outline of something large and unidentified, lying quietly in the dark of a Washington forest on a September night in the year 2000, as if it had always been there and had simply never needed to be explained. The records in this field are full of moments like that one, moments where a physical trace outlasts the event that produced it, where the evidence is clear enough to be documented and ambiguous enough to remain open, where the details are specific and the conclusion is not. Jerry Crew's cast measured 16 inches. William Rowe's creature ate leaves from a bush in the October light. Jeannie Chapman walked several miles with her children to get away from something that later left 16-inch prints in the dirt of her yard. Roger Patterson ran toward the tree line at Bluff Creek with a camera, and what he filmed has not been explained in the time since, though many people have tried. These are the accounts that pulled the question of the large unknown creature of the Pacific Northwest out of the narrow channels of regional oral tradition and placed it in the broader record, in newspapers and films, and affidavits and plaster casts that could be held and examined and argued over by anyone who wanted to engage with them. They did not settle the question, they widened it. Each one added a specific date and a specific place and a specific set of details to a record that by the end of the 20th century had grown large enough to constitute something that required a response, either an explanation or an honest acknowledgement that no explanation had yet been found. The response has been ongoing ever since. The evidence is still being examined. The accounts are still being filed. And the Skookum cast rests in its facility with the impression of a heel at one end, and the curve of what might be a forearm running diagonally across its face, and the quiet, open, entirely unresolved question of what it is that made it, something large, resting in a forest at night, leaving behind only its shape pressed gently into the mud beside the water. The water in Bluff Creek moves over the same stones it has always moved over. In the early morning, before the logging road above it catches any direct light, the canyon sits in a particular kind of dimness, not dark exactly, but filtered, as though the old-growth canopy overhead has decided to hold the day at a certain distance for as long as it can. The creek itself runs narrow and cold, and the sound it makes fills the corridor from wall to wall, so that there is no moment of silence down there, only the continuous soft conversation of water finding the lowest path. The trees that line the banks are Douglas firs and Sitka spruce, some of them 5 and 6 feet across at the base, their lower branches beginning 30 feet overhead, everything between the ground and those branches wrapped in shadow and damp air, and the smell of decomposing wood. This is not a dramatic landscape. It is simply a very old one, and very dense, and the road that was cut into the hillside above the creek in the late 1950s was one of the first roads most of this country had ever seen. Bluff Creek sits in the Six Rivers National Forest in Humboldt County, in the far northern corner of California, where the Klamath River drains an enormous watershed of steep ridgelines and river bottoms running toward the Pacific. The country here is folded and irregular. Ridges rise and fall without the kind of regularity that makes a landscape easy to navigate, and the old-growth timber that follows the water creates a series of long green corridors that are accessible from above, only where a road has been deliberately cut in, and roadless everywhere else. From the air, if the weather is clear enough, Bluff Creek looks like a single thread of green pulled through a terrain of darker green. The canyon narrow enough that the canopy nearly closes over the water in places, the whole drainage hidden and continuous, and largely unchanged from how it looked before anyone built a road near it. Most of it remains that way now. The road that prompted the first widely reported encounters is still there, still accessed by a long drive up from the valley below, still ending where the timber and the terrain made further construction impractical. Dozens of independent sighting reports from the Bluff Creek drainage have been filed across 7 decades, from the late 1950s through the present, and the landscape itself seems to hold those reports without contradiction. That is the kind of country where something large could move for long distances without crossing a road or a cleared field. The creek provides water, the forest provides cover, the ridges above provide perspective. What the terrain offers, in other words, is exactly what wildlife habitat is supposed to offer: a continuous connected landscape with the resources to support a population of something large enough to leave impressions in the soft ground near the water, something heavy enough that the impressions run deep, something that has apparently been returning to this watershed for longer than the road above it has existed. The Olympic Peninsula of Washington State extends west from the Cascades into the Pacific in a way that gives it weather unlike anywhere else in the country. The rain that arrives from the ocean has nowhere to go but up against the Olympic Mountains, and what it deposits on the way down the western slopes is extraordinary. The Hohe Rainforest, which runs along the Hohe River through the western part of Olympic National Park, receives between 12 and 14 feet of rainfall each year. The result is a forest that looks and feels different from any other temperate woodland in North America. The trees draped in club moss and licorice fern, the ground so soft with accumulated organic matter that footsteps are absorbed rather than heard, the whole ecosystem running at a density and moisture level that produces a particular quality of stillness. Not silence exactly, but a muffling of the ordinary sounds of wind and movement, so complete that the forest seems to exist at one remove from the outside world. The trail through the Hohe Rainforest follows the river for miles. The river itself is wide and gray-green in winter, colored by glacial flour carried down from the Olympic peaks, and it braids and shifts across a broad floodplain of gravel bars and stands of cottonwood and alder. The transition between the rainforest and the river corridor is one of the most ecologically productive zones on the peninsula, the kind of edge habitat where two different environments meet, and the food resources of both become available to anything that lives nearby. The BFRO database holds more Bigfoot sighting reports per square mile from the Olympic Peninsula than from almost anywhere else in the country, and when those reports are mapped against the landscape they describe, the river corridors appear again and again. The Han, the Quinault, the Sol Duc, the Queets, names that follow the water from the interior mountains to the coast, each one a continuous green highway running through country that is otherwise very difficult to move through on foot. Witnesses in the Olympic Peninsula accounts tend to describe encounters in transitional zones, the edge of a clear cut where second-growth forest is coming back in a dense tangle, the margin between old growth and the alder that follows a stream, a logging road at dusk, the cleared right-of-way providing the only long sight line in a landscape that is otherwise intimate and enclosed. These are the places where visibility briefly opens, where a large animal might be seen before it steps back into the cover that makes it invisible at any other angle. The reports from this part of Washington go back far enough in documented form to suggest a consistency that is, at minimum, a useful thing to know about. The Cascade Range runs north to south through Washington and Oregon like a spine, its western slopes catching the same Pacific moisture that saturates the Olympics, its eastern slopes in rain shadow, dry and open, the forest thinning to ponderosa pine, and eventually to sagebrush country. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest occupies a broad section of the southern Washington Cascades, and the landscape there is a mixture of old-growth timber in the river valleys, regenerating forest on the slopes that were logged or burned, and the higher elevation ground of ridges and volcanic terrain. Mount St. Helens sits at the western edge of the Gifford Pinchot, and the country around it has been shaped not just by logging and fire, but by the eruption of 1980, which rearranged enormous areas of forest into something that looks decades later like a slow-motion study in ecological recovery. Standing dead timber gradually falling, young alder and willow filling the disturbance zones, elk returning in numbers that have grown substantially since the eruption opened the overstory and let the understory come in. The Gifford Pinchot has one of the higher concentrations of reported encounters in the Pacific Northwest, and the mix of habitats there, old growth, edge zones, recovering disturbance areas, river corridors, provides a model for understanding why certain landscapes seem to appear in sighting accounts more often than others. The old growth areas offer the long-term stability of an undisturbed forest ecosystem. The recovering areas offer the food abundance that follows disturbance, the berries, the young browse, the density of smaller animals that move in when the canopy opens. And the river corridors connect them, running through both types of landscape, providing the navigable routes that large animals use to move between habitat patches without having to cross exposed ridgelines. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for more than 2,000 miles from the northeastern corner of Georgia to the western edge of Maine, and across that entire range, the terrain shifts from the broad hardwood coves of the southern Appalachians to the spruce and fir forests of the northern summits, but the underlying character of the landscape remains consistent. Old mountains, heavily forested, with river drainages running in every direction, and a complicated interior that the roads and towns follow only approximately. The Appalachians have been settled for longer than the Pacific Northwest, farmed longer, logged more thoroughly in most places, and the old growth that once covered much of the range is largely gone. What remains is a patchwork of second growth and regenerating forest, state and national forest land, and the small woodlots and farm borders that cover a substantial amount of the rural landscape from one end of the range to the other. Bigfoot reports from the Appalachian states are numerous, and the states that appear most often in the BFRO database from this region are West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. This is a somewhat different landscape from the one that produces the high-density Pacific Northwest accounts. The forests are younger on average, more fragmented, more closely bordered by agricultural land and roads. Reports from this region tend to describe encounters near creek bottoms, at the edges of fields where the woodlots begin, and along rural roads at night, when the combination of darkness and the limited visibility of a car's headlights creates the kind of brief partial sighting that is difficult to evaluate and difficult to forget. The creature described in these eastern accounts is recognizable from the western reports: large, upright, hair-covered, with a stride that witnesses consistently describe as longer than any human stride they have seen. What is notable about the Appalachian reports is the habitat context they sit within. The creek bottoms of West Virginia and Pennsylvania are often the last continuous green corridors in otherwise fragmented landscapes, the places where a woodland animal might move between larger forest patches without crossing open ground. The farm borders of Ohio and western Pennsylvania sit at the edge of what was once the great eastern hardwood forest, and in some counties the remaining woodlots are large enough and connected enough to support populations of animals that most people in those counties never see. White-tailed deer, black bears, coyotes, and mountain lions, in places where they have returned, all of them inhabit the same fragmented corridor landscape that shows up in the spatial pattern of Bigfoot reports. The eastern accounts are not as geographically concentrated as the Bluff Creek or Olympic Peninsula clusters, but they follow the same logic Encounters near water, in forest edge habitat, away from the densest human settlement. The Ouachita Mountains occupy a broad arc of terrain across western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, and the country around them is different in character from the Pacific Northwest or the Appalachians. The Ouachita National Forest covers about 8 million acres of mixed pine and hardwood, and the landscape it occupies is gentler in relief than the Cascades or the Olympics, but larger in area and more remote in its interior than much of the Appalachian Range. The rivers that drain the Ouachitas, the Ouachita itself, the Little Missouri, the Saline, run wide and slow through country that is sparsely populated and largely wooded, with the highway system following the valleys and the ridges between them, holding long stretches of roadless forest. Honobia is a small community in LaFleur County, Oklahoma, at the eastern edge of the Ouachita National Forest, and the country around it sits at the convergence of several river drainages and the forested ridges above them. The community hosts an annual Bigfoot festival that draws researchers and witnesses from across the region, and the surrounding area has produced a substantial body of sighting reports over several decades. A multi-night series of incidents reported by a local family in 1999 and 2000, which involved persistent loud sounds and apparent disturbances around their property over several weeks, became one of the most detailed accounts from this region and has been discussed at length in the community of researchers who focus on behavioral patterns in reported encounters. The Ouachita reports share the spatial characteristics of accounts from other high-density regions: proximity to water, to forest edge, to the transitional zones between the timber and the more open ground of the valley floors. The forests of the Ouachita in autumn look different from any other Bigfoot landscape. The hardwood ridges go red and orange as the temperatures drop, and the pine-dominated hollows stay green below them, and the color contrast between the ridge tops and the bottoms is visible for miles on clear days. The river corridors through the bottom ground stay green the longest, the sycamores and cottonwoods holding their leaves after the oaks and maples on the slopes have dropped theirs, and the deer trails that run between the bottom and the ridge travel through a landscape that is both open enough to move through and sheltered enough to provide cover. The scale of the Ouachita country is not as immediately dramatic as the coastal ranges of the Pacific Northwest, but the area of contiguous forest it provides is substantial, and the combination of low road density, river corridor access, and proximity to the transitional habitat of the valley borders creates conditions that appear, across many different regions, to be associated with where reports tend to cluster. The BFRO database, which represents the most comprehensive single collection of Bigfoot sighting reports in North America, holds more than 5,000 entries spanning all 50 states and multiple Canadian provinces. Washington State appears at the top of the rankings by total report volume, followed by California, Florida, Ohio, and Oregon, and the pattern of states in the upper tier is not a simple one. It is not only the most forested states or only the most sparsely populated ones, but something more complicated than either of those explanations on its own would produce. Florida, which ranks near the top in total report volume, is not mountainous or particularly cold, and its forests are swamp cypress and longleaf pine rather than the old-growth fir and spruce of the Pacific Northwest. But it has its own version of the same spatial logic: river swamps and drainage corridors that are difficult to access and rarely entered, wetland borders where forest and open water meet, a level of habitat continuity in its larger preserves that supports populations of animals most Floridians never encounter. Independent statistical analysis of the BFRO database has identified clustering patterns in the report distribution that correlate with several measurable geographic variables: proximity to rivers and streams, areas of forested elevation change, and regions of low road density. These are not the kinds of patterns that a random distribution of false reports would be expected to produce. Random fabrications would be expected to cluster near population centers, near famous prior sighting locations, or in no particular pattern at all. The spatial clustering that emerges from the database is instead consistent with the habitat preferences of a large forest-dwelling mammal that uses river corridors for movement and avoids areas of high human activity. Whether that consistency reflects a real animal moving through real landscapes or something else about how and where sighting experiences tend to occur is a question the statistics alone cannot settle. But the pattern is there, and it is not shapeless. River corridors appear in the data not just as incidental backdrop, but as a consistent structural feature of where reports come from. The Bluff Creek drainage in California, the Hopi and Quinault and Sol Duc on the Olympic Peninsula, the creek bottoms of West Virginia and Pennsylvania, the river valleys of the Ouachita, the swamp drainages of Florida's interior. Across 5,000 reports, collected over 7 decades, from witnesses who had no knowledge of one another and no access to a centralized map of where other reports had come from, the water keeps appearing, the low ground near the river, the soft mud of the bank where a print might hold, the transition from the open gravel bar to the closed forest, the moment between one kind of terrain and another. There is something straightforward about why a large animal would be found near water, if a large animal is what is being found. Water is a basic resource, and the landscape around water tends to be the most productive in terms of food. More browse, more fruit, more smaller animals, more of everything that something very large would need to eat in sufficient quantity. The river corridors of the Pacific Northwest are among the most ecologically rich environments on the continent, and the large animals that move through them do so predictably, returning to the same stretches of riverbank and the same seasonal food sources year after year. That predictability is what makes wildlife observation possible in the first place, and it is also in the accounts of witnesses who have reported encounters what seems to bring them to the same kinds of places that appear in the records again and again. The Quinault Valley on the Olympic Peninsula is a good example of what all of this looks like in practice. The Quinault River drains the southern portion of the Olympics, running from the high snowfields on the ridge crest down through a valley of extraordinary old-growth Sitka spruce and western red cedar. Some of the largest trees in the world live in this valley, trees that have been growing since before European settlement of the continent, trees whose bases are wider than most living rooms and whose root systems extend through a depth of soil that has accumulated over millennia of undisturbed growth. The understory of the Quinault old growth is a different kind of space from the open floor of a younger forest, densely layered, with multiple levels of vegetation between the ground and the canopy, a three-dimensional interior that is simultaneously very close and very deep. The trail that runs through the old-growth loop on the south shore of Lake Quinault is one of the more accessible routes into this kind of forest. And in winter, when the moss on every surface is at its most saturated green and the cedar limbs droop under their accumulated moisture, the place seems to belong to a different temporal register than the road and the parking area a mile away. The Sol Duc drainage further north on the peninsula has a somewhat different character. The river there runs faster, the valley narrower, the old growth punctuated by areas of younger regenerating forest where logging roads cut in from the valley walls. The combination of mature old growth in the deeper valley and younger, more open forest on the disturbed slopes creates the kind of transitional habitat that appears consistently in the landscape profile of high-density sighting areas, the edge between closed canopy and open secondary growth, the place where an animal might move between two different resource environments within a short distance. Reports from the Solduke drainage in the BFRO database span multiple decades and tend to describe encounters in exactly this transitional zone at the boundary between the old trees and the younger ones, where sight lines briefly open before closing again. What the Pacific Northwest as a whole offers that other regions do not, at least not in the same combination, is the particular configuration of scale and remoteness and ecological richness that the coastal ranges provide. The Cascades and the Olympics together cover an enormous area of terrain that is technically accessible by road, but in practice very difficult to enter off-road. The logging road networks that run through much of this country are extensive but impermanent, and large sections of terrain between the roads are effectively untraveled by people. The valleys are deep, the ridges are steep, the weather is often wet enough to make overland travel uncomfortable, and the forest dense enough to reduce visibility to a few dozen feet. A large animal that preferred to avoid contact with people would have, in this landscape, a great deal of effective space to do so. Eastern Washington and northeastern Oregon have a different character again. The Blue Mountains, which run across the corner where the two states meet, sit in the drier country east of the Cascades, and the forest there is open ponderosa pine on the lower slopes, transitioning to mixed conifer at higher elevations, with the river bottoms holding dense willows and cottonwoods that look almost anomalous against the drier hillsides above. The Walla Walla and Grand Ronde drainages cut through this country in long, winding canyons, and the combination of the canyon walls and the river corridor vegetation creates a habitat that supports large mammals in substantial numbers, despite the generally drier conditions. Elk populations in the Blue Mountains are among the highest in the Pacific Northwest, and the same rivers that support those elk also appear in Bigfoot accounts from this corner of the country. The pattern of reports following water is clearest when the data is displayed visually, the colored pins of a regional map arranged not by state or county, but by proximity to named rivers and drainages, and the clustering that emerges is unmistakably aligned with the waterways. Not every report comes from a riverside location, and there are accounts from high-ridge terrain and open grassland borders that do not fit the general pattern as neatly. But the modal location in the database, the place that the most reports describe, is somewhere near a river, somewhere in or at the edge of forest, somewhere that the road density is low enough that a person driving through would pass without stopping, and somewhere that the combination of water and cover and food resources creates the habitat that large animals have always sought. The forests that produce the highest densities of reports are, in most cases, not particularly remote by any absolute measure. Bluff Creek is accessible by road. The Ho-Ha's rainforest has a maintained trail. The Ouachita National Forest has a highway running through it. But all of these places share a quality that is harder to quantify than road access or distance from a town, a quality of depth, perhaps, a sense that the forest continues beyond what is visible from the road or the trail, that the interior of it is larger than its perimeter suggests. Old-growth forest has this quality in particular: the visual complexity of an old-growth stand, the multiple canopy layers, the standing and fallen dead wood, the understory shrubs, and the moss carpet, and the deep shadow between the trunks, creates an experience of interior space that is different from the more legible landscape of a younger, managed forest. A person standing at the edge of old growth feels the extent of it without being able to see it, and that felt extent is part of what makes certain landscapes register as genuinely wild in a way that others do not. The Hoh, at its best, has this quality. The Quinault Valley has it. The deeper sections of the Bluff Creek Canyon have it, especially in the early morning when the mist is still in the creek bottom and the canopy is closing the light overhead, and the sound of the water is the only thing carrying clearly through the air. These are the places that appear in sighting accounts across the whole span of documented records, and they are also, independently of any account, simply remarkable places to be, places where the forest is doing what forests do when no one has interfered with them for a very long time, which is to become layered and complex and full of things that are easy to miss. The question of what is being seen in these landscapes is one that the landscapes themselves do not answer. The terrain provides habitat that would support a large animal. The ecology provides the food resources and movement corridors that a large animal would use. The spatial distribution of reports follows the patterns that wildlife biology would predict for a large, cryptic, water-dependent primate. None of that is evidence of what it seems to suggest, and none of it resolves the question of whether what witnesses have reported is a real creature or some combination of misidentification, error, and the particular intensity that wild landscapes can produce in the people who enter them. That the pattern is there, running along the rivers and through the old growth and across the state lines from British Columbia to Florida and back again, a quiet, persistent alignment between where the reports come from and where the forest is deepest and the water runs closest to the trees. The BFRO map, if a person were to look at it from across a room, would show clusters of colored pins that follow the major river systems of the Pacific Northwest, like tributaries themselves, pooling thickly where the old growth is densest, thinning where the landscape opens into farmland or suburb, picking up again where the forest resumes along the next watershed. The same pattern appears at smaller scale across the Appalachians and the Ouachitas and the swamp corridors of the southeast. It is not the pattern of a rumor spreading outward from a famous location, which would show a different kind of clustering, concentric, fading with distance. It is the pattern of a thing that has a preference, or at least a range, and the range follows the water. Whatever is being tracked by those pins, the landscape they mark is real. The rivers are real. The old growth is real, where it persists. The mud of the riverbanks is real, and the soft ground around the water, and the long, uninterrupted corridors of forest that run between the ridges and the coast. Whatever moves through these places, bear or elk or black-tailed deer or something else, something larger and not yet accounted for in any catalog of North American mammals, moves through terrain that has held its character for a very long time, terrain that was already old when the first accounts were recorded, and that remains, in its deepest and wettest and most continuous sections, as unhurried and as self-contained as it has ever been. The water keeps moving, the old trees keep growing, one ring at a time, in the dark and the quiet of a forest that does not particularly need to be found. A figure standing in a forest clearing with the top of its head level with the lowest branches of a young fir tree is not something the mind adjusts to immediately. The scale takes a moment to resolve. A fir tree's lowest branches in second-growth Pacific Northwest forest sit somewhere between 7 and 8 feet from the ground, and the figure stands level with them, unhurried, its weight distributed across both feet in a way that seems to suggest it has been standing there for some time. This is the detail that appears most often across the widest range of accounts, and it tends to be the first detail given, not the color of the hair, not the smell, not the sound, the height. Something that tall, in a place where nothing that tall is supposed to walk upright, takes a moment to settle into. Across the documented record of eyewitness accounts, estimated heights cluster most frequently between 7 and 7.5 feet. The estimates come from witnesses in California and Washington and British Columbia and Pennsylvania and Oklahoma, from people who were on foot and people who were driving, from people who had seconds to look and people who had considerably longer, and the central figures remain largely consistent across all of them. Weights, which are necessarily rougher estimates, tend to fall between 400 and 800 pounds, with the middle of that range appearing most often. Doctors en Nachter en Blanclein, die Wilsrey Ariel Paint, a two, and Wermergen Tard Stubborn Part Ninulekan. Jeff Meldrum, who has spent decades collecting and analyzing the physical evidence associated with these accounts, has noted that the consistency of these central measurements across separated reports is itself a meaningful data point. When people invent descriptions, the details tend to scatter. When people describe the same physical thing, they tend to converge. The consistency is not perfect, and no one working seriously in this area claims that it is. Heights at the lower end of the range and heights considerably above 8 feet both appear in the record. Some witnesses describe something closer to 6.5 feet. Others report 9 or 10. The outliers are there, but the middle of the distribution holds, and it holds across geography, across decade, and across the cultural backgrounds of the witnesses who report it, which is, at minimum, the kind of pattern that rewards a second look. Dark brown to black is the most commonly reported hair color in the record. The accounts that use more specific language describe something close to the coat of a black bear, but longer, and covering the full body, including the face and the backs of the hands, with the hair lying in a particular direction on the limbs and trunk in a way witnesses sometimes struggle to articulate clearly but consistently attempt to describe. The second most common color reported is a reddish-brown or auburn, a variant that appears with particular frequency in Pacific Northwest accounts and in the reports coming out of northern Canada, British Columbia, Alberta, the forested interior, where the reddish tint is noted often enough to suggest either a regional population difference or a consistent pattern in the way forest light plays across dark mammalian hair at certain times of day. Both remain possible. Gray or white individuals appear in the record as well, though much less frequently. When they appear, witnesses sometimes offer the interpretation that what they were looking at was an older animal, that the graying of the coat, consistent with what is seen in many mammal species as they age, indicated an individual late in its life. This interpretation is offered by the witnesses themselves, not by researchers, and it is offered in a tentative way, as the kind of reasoning a person applies when they encounter something large and unfamiliar and reach instinctively for the closest available frame of reference. An old animal, something that has been here for a long time. That is the thought that seems to come. The hair itself, in close range accounts, is frequently described as having a particular movement in it, not the stiffness of a costume or a flat pelt, but the independent ripple of individual strands catching air or light as the animal moves. Witnesses who describe this detail tend to emphasize it as though it was the thing that convinced them most thoroughly of what they were looking at. A costume does not move that way. Fur on a living body does in the slight, continuous, unrepeatable way that living bodies carry the air around them. The footprint evidence gives the clearest picture of scale, and it gives it in the most durable form. A plaster cast can be measured. The length of a footprint does not depend on the emotional state of the person who saw it, or on the conditions of light, or on how long they had to observe. Footprint length in the documented record most commonly falls between 14 and 18 inches, with 16 appearing frequently enough to function as something close to a central value. Stride lengths, calculated from trackway evidence, the distance between individual footfalls across a sequence, typically fall between 4 and 6 feet. The average human stride, measured heel to heel during normal walking, runs about 2.5 feet. A stride of 4 to 6 feet on a bipedal animal implies leg length and forward propulsion of a scale consistent with the height estimates given by eyewitnesses, which is the kind of internal consistency that researchers find useful when assessing whether the evidence across different categories is describing the same thing. Dr. Meldrum's analysis of the TrackCast record has focused considerably on what he describes as mid-tarsal flexibility, a quality visible in some casts that suggests the foot was capable of bending at a point roughly midway along its length, producing a different pressure distribution pattern from that of a rigid human foot. The human foot, supported by the longitudinal arch, meets the ground in a specific sequence and produces a specific pattern of pressure distribution across the sole. A foot without that arch, or with a different arch geometry, would meet the ground differently and would leave a different record in soft substrate. The casts that show this mid-tarsal flexibility show it in a consistent way across different collection sites in different years, which is what makes the detail significant rather than merely curious. A single cast showing an unusual pattern might reflect unusual conditions. A pattern that repeats across a body of evidence is something different. Pressure distribution ridges, small raised formations visible in the plaster of some casts near the ball of the foot and along the outer edge, appear in enough examples that Meldrum and others have treated them as additional evidence of a consistent underlying anatomy. The heel, in many casts, is notably wide and rounded, wider relative to foot length than in a typical human foot. The toes are broad and in some impressions show a slight splaying at the moment of weight transfer, as though the foot was making a larger contact area than a constrained human shoe would allow. These are the kinds of details that are difficult to introduce deliberately into a faked impression, because producing them consistently requires knowing in advance which details will later be subject to analysis, and the analysis that identified them did not exist when most of the older casts were made. A track cast laid on a research table with a standard ruler beside it produces a specific effect in the person looking at it. The heel is at one end. The ruler begins at 0. By the time the measurement reaches 12 inches, there is still more cast. By 16 inches, the toes begin. The proportions are not human, and the scale is not something the mind adjusts to without a moment's pause. The cast is simply there, cool and white, with the particular density of plaster that has been poured into an outdoor impression in soft ground, and it holds every detail the ground held at the moment of the footfall. Whatever pressed into that earth was not light. The Sierra Nevada mountains of California in the early 1970s were the site of a series of audio recordings that have been discussed in research contexts for decades. Ron Moorhead and Al Berry, camping at high elevation in the mountains over several seasons, captured on a standard cassette recorder a series of vocalizations they could not account for. The recordings, which ran across multiple sessions and included long exchanges of complex sound, were not the kind of brief anomalous noise that might reflect a single unusual event. They were extended, structured, and varied, and the same quality of vocalization appeared across multiple recording sessions separated by time. What the recordings contain, when listened to carefully, is a rapid cascading series of sounds that do not correspond to any entry in a standard field guide to North American wildlife. The range is wide. Individual vocalizations shift in pitch and duration in ways that suggest either a vocal tract of considerable size or a degree of tonal control not associated with known North American animals. Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, a linguist at the University of Wyoming, analyzed the recordings and concluded that the vocalizations were unlikely to have been produced by a known human or animal source. The basis of that conclusion was spectrographic. The frequency range and the rate of articulation both exceeded what a human voice is capable of producing, even under extreme conditions. Dr. Scott Nelson, a retired cryptologic linguist who had spent his career working for the U.S. Navy analyzing audio for patterns and structure, reached a related conclusion when he conducted his own analysis. What the recordings suggested in his assessment was a vocal tract significantly larger than that of an adult human male, the kind of size that would be consistent with a body of considerable mass, if the relationship between body size and vocal anatomy held the way it does in known primates. The recordings have not been definitively explained. Several researchers have proposed known sources: bears, elk, human voices processed through terrain, and none of these explanations have been found fully satisfying by the linguists who have studied the material most closely. The cassette reels have been duplicated and reanalyzed. The spectrograms have been examined more than once. What sits at the end of all that examination is a set of sounds recorded in a mountain forest that remain in the careful and specific language of the people who studied them, inconsistent with any identified source. That is a different claim from saying the sounds are unexplainable. It means only that the identification has not been made. The recordings continue to exist, and the forests where they were made continue to exist, and both are the same as they were. The smell is the detail that researchers and witnesses alike tend to mention with a particular kind of emphasis, because it is the detail that is hardest to explain away and hardest to reproduce. A powerful repulsive odor, described by different witnesses in different decades as combining elements of rotting flesh, wet animal hair, skunk, and feces, appears in close-range encounter accounts from nearly every region where Bigfoot reports are common, and it appears in the older accounts as well as the contemporary ones. Indigenous oral tradition descriptions of the creature, recorded by anthropologists in the early 20th century, include the smell as one of the consistent identifying details. Settler accounts from the same period include it. Accounts filed with contemporary research organizations include it. The smell crosses time and crosses geography in a way that makes it one of the most consistent elements in the entire documented record. What makes the odor detail particularly durable is that it is the kind of thing people do not tend to invent. A person constructing a sighting account for effect will typically emphasize the visual, the height, the hair, the eyes, the speed of movement. The smell is a stranger detail to include, less dramatic in the way it lands on a listener, less easily imagined by someone who has not encountered it. Witnesses who include it often describe struggling to find adequate language for it, reaching for comparisons, and then rejecting them as insufficient. Several accounts include the observation that the smell hit the witness before the figure was visible, that the odor arrived first through a tree line or across a field or along a river corridor, and that the visual encounter, when it came, confirmed what the smell had already suggested was nearby. The smell has been cataloged under several proposed biological explanations, none of which has moved fully past the status of hypothesis. Some researchers have suggested that large primates generally produce more intense body odor than humans do, and that a very large, long-haired primate living in a humid forested environment might produce a smell of corresponding intensity. Others have noted that some known animals produce powerful musk-like or fecal-adjacent odors as territorial or communicative signals, and that an unknown large primate might do the same. These are reasonable propositions in the context of an unidentified species. They remain propositions. What is not in question is that the smell appears in the record, persistently and across separated accounts, in a way that gives researchers who have read widely in the primary source material reason to treat it as something other than incidental. A witness standing at the edge of a forest road at dusk, in the particular silence that settles between the last bird sounds and the beginning of the night insect chorus, describes the smell arriving before anything visual, a thick animal heaviness in the air that is nothing like the ordinary smells of forest or soil or decay. The trees beyond the ditch are still. Nothing moves that can be seen. The smell is simply there, and it is definite, and it is not a smell that belongs to anything the witness can name. This is the quality that stays in accounts of close-range encounters across the record, not the sight of something, not the sound of something, but the certainty that something is very close, and that the closest available category for it is the smell of a large animal, of a kind the witness has never encountered before. The figure moving through second-growth forest at the edge of a clearing, its reddish-brown hair catching the late afternoon light, differently from the shadows behind it, leaves a particular impression in accounts that are detailed enough to include it, with a quality of deliberateness in each footfall that several witnesses have compared to the movement of a large bear. But upright, the weight committed fully with each step, the body not bobbing in the way a human body bobs when walking fast, but moving instead in a kind of fluid forward drive that several witnesses describe as efficient rather than fast. The arm swing in many close observation accounts is noted as greater than a human arm swing, longer arcs, the arms reaching proportionally lower relative to the body, the shoulders wide enough that the arms hang at an angle that is not quite the angle at which human arms hang. These are the kinds of anatomical details that witnesses typically notice without having the language to name them precisely, and the way they surface across accounts from witnesses who have no apparent connection to one another is one of the things researchers in the field find most consistent and most worth attending to. A gray-haired individual moving slowly through Pacific Northwest forest in winter rain, the coat darkened with moisture, the shape enormous against the white of a snow-patched hillside, appears in accounts from the northern end of the range with enough frequency that some researchers have proposed the possibility of something like a regional population with distinct coloration. The winter rainforest in Washington or British Columbia has a particular quality of light, flat and diffuse, everything the same gray-green, and a large gray figure moving through it is, in the accounts that describe it, both conspicuous and strangely appropriate, as though the coloration matches the season the way coloration in many mammals does. The upright posture across all accounts is nearly universal. A small number of reports describe the animal moving briefly on all fours, typically in the context of climbing a slope or moving quickly across difficult terrain. The resting position, the walking position, and the position described in accounts where the animal was observed watching from a distance are all upright, and consistently so. The torso in these descriptions is described as lacking the pronounced neck and shoulder separation, typical of a human figure, a quality sometimes described as the head appearing to sit lower or more forward on the body than a human head, giving the profile a slightly different silhouette against the trees or the sky. This anatomical detail, which witnesses typically note with difficulty and describe imprecisely, appears across accounts from researchers and casual witnesses, alike in a form consistent enough to be treated as a recurring observation rather than a coincidental one. The face, in close-range accounts, is described with the kind of specificity that suggests the observer was genuinely attempting to record what they saw rather than to construct a satisfying image. Flat nose, heavy brow, dark eyes, large relative to the face, and hair covering the forehead and cheeks, with the central facial features, nose, mouth, the area around the eyes, less densely covered. Several accounts include the detail that the eyes reflected light in darkness, in the way the eyes of many nocturnal or semi-nocturnal animals do, a characteristic called eyeshine, produced by a reflective layer behind the retina called the tapetum lucidum. This detail appears in enough accounts from enough separated regions that some researchers have treated it as one of the more anatomically specific recurring observations in the record. What draws researchers back to the consistency of the physical description across all of its variations and all of its categories is the difficulty of accounting for it without proposing either a genuine unknown animal or a degree of coordinated fabrication across thousands of separated witnesses that becomes, at a certain point, more improbable than the alternative. The accounts come from hunters and hikers and loggers and truck drivers and forestry workers and school children and retired couples on camping holidays. They come from people with no apparent interest in the topic before their encounter, and from people with deep and long-standing familiarity with wild places. They come from regions with no shared media tradition linking them, and from decades before the internet made the transmission of detailed images and descriptions instantaneous. The consistency across all of that is what the evidence presents, and what researchers who take it seriously have spent the most time with. A plaster cast from Washington State, resting on a shelf beside cast from California and Oregon and British Columbia and Ohio and Pennsylvania, with a small label indicating the location and year of collection, holds in its surface the record of a single moment, the weight of something pressing into soft ground, the exact topography of a foot sole at the instant of full contact, the edges of the impression, where the displaced earth moved outward and upward. Each cast is different in its details. Each one reflects different ground conditions, different weather, different substrate, but the proportions across the collection are consistent in a way that is difficult to look past. The heel is always wide, the foot is always long. Whatever pressed these impressions was not small. The sum of the consistent details, the height clustering between 7 and 7.5 feet, the dark hair with the reddish variant appearing regularly in the northern range, the stride that covers 4 to 6 feet between steps, the wide-heeled foot with its distinctive pressure distribution, the vocalizations that exceeded the measured range of known human and animal sources, and the smell that arrives before the visual and persists after the figure is gone, represents the aggregate of what witnesses across a century of documented reports have described. No single detail is enough on its own. Any one of them can be questioned. The smell can be proposed as imagination or misidentification. The height can be attributed to distance and lighting. The footprints can be argued as fabrications. But the aggregate, taken as a whole and read across its full geographical and temporal spread, is the thing that researchers like Meldrum have argued deserves more than dismissal. Not proof, not confirmation. Something that exists, that is accumulated, that continues to be added to, and that has not yet found an explanation that accounts for all of it at once. The cassette tape sitting in a Sierra Nevada base camp, its reels turning slowly in the mountain dark while the pines moved in the wind above it, captured something that has not been fully explained. The plaster cast sitting on a research table, cool and white, holds the record of a foot that did not belong to anything the investigator had a name for. The forest road at dusk, and the smell arriving first, and the silence of the trees afterward, this is the shape the evidence takes. Specific moments, each one separate, each one documented in its own context, each one adding its weight to an accumulation that the evidence, honestly considered, cannot yet resolve. The odor, returning at the close of the described record, is worth remaining with for a moment, not as something alarming, but as the detail that seems, when the whole account is spread across the table, most difficult to attribute to invention or error. It is reported by people who gain nothing from reporting it. It is reported in accounts that are otherwise sober and particular. It appears in the earliest documented descriptions and in reports made last year. Smell more than sight, more than sound, more than the measured length of a footprint in plaster, is the sense that bypasses the part of the mind that arranges experience into story. It is immediate. It lands before interpretation. A smell recorded in an account is not a measurement or an observation. It is a memory that the body made before the mind had a chance to decide what to do with it. And the memory that a great many people seem to have carried out of their brief encounters with whatever they encountered in the forests of North America is the same one across 100 years and 1,000 miles of separated country. Something large, something alive, something carrying the particular unmistakable smell of an animal unlike any they had met before in any forest, on any road, at any hour of any ordinary day, that turned, in a moment, into something they would spend the rest of their lives attempting, with varying degrees of success, to simply and accurately describe. The room where Dr. Jeff Meldrum keeps his casts is not large, but it holds more than 300 of them. They line the shelves along the walls, each one tagged with a location and a year, arranged the way a careful person arranges things they have been collecting for a long time, not to impress, but because there is simply nowhere else to put them now. The plaster is pale and dense. The smell of it, faintly mineral and dry, sits in the air the way old paper does in a library. Some of the casts are small, almost unremarkable. Some run to 16 inches or more, wide across the heel, the toes spread and blunt at the far end, the whole impression suggesting something that stood with considerable weight, pressing into soft ground before it moved on, and left this behind. Meldrum is a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. He has spent decades working with this material in the way that anatomists work, not with stories, but with shape and proportion, with the mechanics of how a foot distributes weight when a body is moving at speed or crossing uneven terrain. What interested him from early in his research was not the existence of the casts themselves, but what the cast showed about the thing that made them: pressure distribution. The width of the stride, a quality he describes as mid-tarsal flexibility, a kind of bending in the middle of the foot that human feet do not do, because the architecture of the human foot does not permit it. He argues, in papers and in his 2006 book, that a number of the casts in his collection show this quality consistently, across samples gathered decades apart in different states and provinces by different researchers who were not in contact with each other at the time. The book is called Sasquatch: Legend Meets Science. It was not written to convince anyone of anything in particular. What it contains is a careful account of what the physical evidence, examined closely, appears to show, and also what it does not show, and where the gaps remain, and why the gaps remain, and what filling those gaps would actually require. Meldrum's position has never been that the question is settled. His position is that the evidence is worth taking seriously enough to examine, and that examining it properly takes a different kind of attention than either dismissing it or accepting it without scrutiny. More than 300 casts along a wall, each one a specific place, a specific year, a specific moment when someone pressed wet plaster into an impression in the ground and waited for it to set, and then carried it home and kept it because they were not sure what else to do with it. The question of what made those impressions has been approached in a number of ways over the decades, and none of those ways has produced a definitive answer. What they have produced is a body of examined material that has been tested, contested, found wanting in some cases, and genuinely puzzling in others, and in every case added to a record that continues to accumulate without resolving cleanly in any direction. In 2012, a veterinary geneticist named Melba Ketchum announced the results of a 5-year study. She had worked with approximately 100 samples, gathered from various locations, and submitted by various researchers over the course of several years. Her claim was that the genetic sequences she had extracted showed evidence of a previously unknown primate. The Dindsey announcement drew considerable attention. It drew shortly afterward considerably more scrutiny. When the sequences she had deposited in the GenBank database were analyzed independently by researchers with no stake in either outcome, the samples were identified as originating from animals already known to science. Bears appeared in the data. Possums, humans, whatever the samples were, the scientific community reviewing the genetic sequences found them consistent with North American species that have been studied at length and documented in detail. The study's conclusions were not accepted, and the consensus on that outcome has remained stable in the years since. The calmest thing that can be said about that finding is also the most accurate one. The samples did not produce the result that was hoped for. That does not tell us with certainty what the samples were measuring, or whether the collection and handling of the material introduced contamination, or whether the original sources were misidentified before they were submitted. It tells us that this particular line of investigation did not yield what it was designed to yield, and that the question it was trying to answer remained, after 5 years and considerable effort, exactly where it had been when the effort began. That is not the same as a closed door. It is more like a locked one that has not yet had the right key tried on it. The question of dermal ridges has occupied a separate and quieter corner of the investigation for some years. Fingerprints in the sense of friction-ridged skin are not something that can easily be faked in pressed earth or soft mud. A hand and a glove will not produce them. A bare human foot will. But human dermal ridges follow patterns that are well understood, and that examiners trained in fingerprint analysis can identify with considerable precision. When researchers collected track casts from the Blue Mountains of Washington state, casts gathered in the field by a man named Paul Freeman in the 1980s and 1990s, some of those casts appeared to show ridge detail on the surface of the impression. A fingerprint examiner named Jimmy Childs, Bohr, and a latent fingerprint specialist named Robert Strom looked at the material and argued that what they were seeing was genuine friction-ridged skin, that the patterns were consistent with dermal structure and inconsistent with anything that would naturally form in soil. Critics of that analysis have suggested that the patterns could be an artifact of how soil compresses and dries, that natural texturing in certain substrates can produce ridge-like parallel lines that resemble friction skin without being friction skin. Neither position has been resolved. What the casts show, under magnification, is a set of faint parallel ridges running across the surface of the plaster at the ball of the foot. Whether those ridges came from skin or from soil depends on an analysis that careful people have looked at from both sides and not yet agreed on, and the disagreement itself has been part of the evidentiary record long enough now to be considered part of the landscape of the question. The FBI's involvement in the subject is one of the more matter-of-fact chapters in the whole story. In 1977, a researcher named Peter Byrne submitted a small quantity of hair samples to the agency with a request that they be analyzed. The submission was formal. The response was formal. What the agency found, stated plainly in a letter typed on official letterhead and mailed back to Byrne, was that the hairs were consistent with the deer family, cervid in origin, not primate. The letter was polite and precise. The hairs were returned with the determination enclosed. For decades, the letter was known to exist, but was not publicly available. In 2019, the FBI released it as part of a document request, and the language in it was exactly what had been reported: a bureaucratic notation of a finding, delivered without ceremony, closing one small inquiry in the way that bureaucracies close inquiries, by producing a document and filing it. What the letter did not address, because it was not asked to, was the broader question. It addressed these hairs, submitted on this date, and found them to be this species. The deer family determination was clear. What that determination says about the larger pattern of submitted samples over decades, most of which have been identified as originating from known animals, most commonly bears, deer, and coyotes, is something that requires careful reading. Researchers in the field have acknowledged for some time that the majority of hair samples attributed to unknown primates turn out to have mundane origins. That is not a surprise to anyone working seriously in the area. It is, in fact, exactly what would be expected if most of the material being collected in the field is misidentified to begin with, and if the genuine anomalous hair, if it exists, is rare enough that finding it requires correctly identifying a large number of ordinary samples first. The honest accounting of the hair evidence is simply this. So far, the samples analyzed by qualified laboratories have not produced a match to an unknown primate. That record is long enough and consistent enough to be meaningful. It is also, given what a single confirmed sample would mean, a reason to keep looking rather than a reason to stop. Jimmy Childs, looking at those Blue Mountains casts under magnification. Melba Ketchum, running sequences through a database for 5 years. Peter Byrne, mailing a small envelope to a federal agency in 1977 and waiting for an answer that came back with a specific and unhelpful precision. These are the textures of the investigative work, patient, often unrewarded, always producing more questions than it puts to rest. That patience is not nothing. It is, in fact, the defining quality of the investigation as it has actually been conducted, as opposed to the way it is sometimes described. Meldrum's laboratory at Idaho State holds the most formally assembled collection of track cast material available anywhere. The casts came from many sources over many years, some submitted directly to him, some acquired from earlier researchers who had held them for decades, some made by his own students in the field. Arranged on the shelving in that pale-lit room, labeled and ordered, they represent the longest sustained physical record of whatever has been producing impressions in the ground across North America for at least a century. The impressions range in quality. Some are sharp and detailed, the dermal surfaces clean, the pressure ridges visible. Some are soft and degraded, the detail lost to time or to the conditions in which the cast was made. Meldrum works with the full range because that is what the field produces, and because good science, in his view, means accounting for the variable quality of the evidence, rather than selecting only the best examples. What the collection shows, when considered as a whole, is a consistency of morphology across a wide geographic range and a long span of time. The width of the heel, the proportional breadth of the midfoot relative to the toe box, the stride lengths calculated from paired impressions that run considerably longer than the average human stride. These features appear in casts from California, from Washington, from British Columbia, from Ohio, from Texas, gathered by different people in different decades under different conditions. The consistency is what Meldrum finds significant, not any single cast, but the pattern that emerges when enough of them are considered together. Patterns are what investigators in every discipline work with. A pattern is not proof. A pattern is a thing to be explained, and the explanation either holds when examined closely, or it does not. The Patterson-Gimlin film has been the subject of its own sustained examination for more than 5 decades. The film is 59.5 seconds long. It was shot on October 20th, 1967, on 16mm color film at Bluff Creek in Northern California by a man named Roger Patterson. The figure visible in the film has been analyzed by biomechanists, by costume designers, by film analysts, by primatologists, and by anatomists. The conclusions have not converged. Some analysts have argued that the gait visible in the footage, the specific way the figure moves its arms, distributes its weight, and places each foot, is inconsistent with a human being walking in a costume, because the mechanics required to produce that gait are not mechanics a costumed person could easily replicate. Others have argued that with a sufficiently well-made costume and a practiced performer, the footage could have been produced. The film has not been debunked in the sense of producing a specific costumer, a specific suit, or a specific performer who can demonstrate that the walk in the film was theirs. Bob Gimlin is still alive. He is in his 80s. He has been speaking publicly about October 20th, 1967 for more than 5 decades, and in that time his account has not changed in any material respect. He describes riding horseback along Bluff Creek when the horses reacted to something ahead, and then seeing the figure. He describes Patterson dismounting, grabbing his camera, and running toward the tree line, while Gimlin stayed mounted with his rifle, watching. He describes the figure moving away through the sand and timber at the edge of the creek, looking back once, continuing on. He describes his own certainty, stated simply and without particular force, that what he observed that afternoon was not a person wearing a costume. That certainty has persisted across 57 years of questions, across skeptical interviewers and friendly ones, across Bigfoot conventions and documentary film crews and casual conversations at events where he sits at a folding table with an old photograph beside him. He does not perform the certainty. He simply has not found a reason to revise it. A man in his 80s, his hands resting on a table, speaking slowly about something he watched for less than a minute in a forest 57 years ago. The photograph beside him shows the figure caught mid-stride, the frame grainy with distance, the trees behind it in the full color of an October afternoon. He was there. That is the one thing that cannot be contested. What the film shows continues to be examined. New techniques have been applied to it as new techniques have become available. Photogrammetric analysis, computer modeling of the gait, digital enhancement of specific frames. Each round of analysis has produced results that are debated by the same careful and sincere people who conducted the last round, The film exists. The debate about it continues. Both of those things are simply true. The wider scientific community has for the most part maintained its distance from the Bigfoot question. That distance is not always as principled as it is sometimes presented. Some researchers who have examined the trackcast evidence or watched the Patterson-Gimlin footage carefully have expressed private interest while avoiding public association with the subject, because the professional costs of public association are well understood in academic settings, and the rewards if the investigation fails to produce a confirmed specimen are minimal. Meldrum is an exception to this pattern, and the professional price of being an exception has been documented. Criticism from colleagues, occasional institutional pressure, the standard costs of working at the edge of what a field considers respectable. He has continued anyway, which says something about the degree to which the material, looked at closely, continues to seem to him worth examining. That kind of sustained, professionally costly, publicly maintained attention is not nothing. It is not proof either. It is simply a data point about the quality of someone's engagement with a question, and that quality has been consistent for decades. Hair samples keep coming in. Track casts keep being made. Researchers with field cameras go out into the woods of Washington and California and British Columbia and come back with footage, most of which is inconclusive, some of which is genuinely puzzling to the analysts who examine it, none of which has yet produced the kind of categorical confirmation that would close the question. The investigation continues in the way that investigations into genuinely uncertain things continue, slowly, expensively in time, if not always in money, with long periods of nothing and occasional moments of something that might be significant and turns out, usually, to be explainable. The explainable outcomes are not failures. They are the investigation working as it is supposed to work, eliminating the ordinary so that the extraordinary, if it is there, becomes more clearly visible by contrast. It is worth holding for a moment what that investigation has actually produced, set against what it has not. What it has produced, a morphologically consistent pattern of trackway evidence across a very large geographic range and a very long span of time, analyzed by qualified anatomists who argue that the pattern is not easily explained by known animals or by systematic hoaxing. What it has produced, a body of eyewitness testimony that across geographic and demographic separation describes a set of physical characteristics with a consistency that researchers find worth noting. What it has produced, audio recordings from the Sierra Nevada that qualified analysts have found difficult to attribute to any known source. What it has not produced, a specimen, confirmed genetic material, or footage of sufficient clarity to remove all plausible interpretation. That balance, specific, accumulated, analyzed evidence on one side, the one categorical thing that would settle the matter absent on the other, is where the investigation rests tonight. It has rested there for decades. The absence of a specimen is not a recent development. It has always been the gap at the center of the question, and everyone working seriously in the area is aware of it, and most of them have thought at length about what that absence means and have not reached the same conclusion. It may mean that the animal does not exist, and that what the evidence represents is a complicated and multi-generational body of misidentification, wishful thinking, and a smaller number of deliberate fabrications that have been difficult to disentangle from the rest. That is a coherent position. Serious people hold it. It may mean that the animal exists in numbers small enough and in terrain remote enough that the odds of finding a body, which is, in the end, what wild animals die as, somewhere in the forest where they fell, decomposing quickly in the wet and leaf-covered ground are lower than intuition suggests. Very large areas of the Pacific Northwest remain genuinely difficult of access. Forests are not transparent. Animals that die in them are consumed, absorbed, and dispersed at a rate that leaves very little physical trace within weeks, and nothing recoverable in most cases within a few months. That is also a coherent position. Serious people hold that one too. The evidence sits between those two positions, pointing clearly in neither direction. That sitting is not a failure of inquiry. It is, in the most exact sense, an open question, one that has been examined with increasing rigor for more than 60 years and has not yet disclosed what it is concealing, if it is concealing anything. What happens in the meantime is that the investigation continues at its own pace, in laboratories and in the field, with the tools that are currently available, and with the hope that better tools will eventually be brought to bear. Environmental DNA sampling, the collection and analysis of genetic material left in water and soil by animals moving through a landscape, has changed the study of animal distribution and ecology, and some researchers have suggested it could be brought usefully to locations with high densities of reported sightings. Whether that has been done at scale and what it has produced is an ongoing question within the research community. The technology exists. The application of it to this particular question is a matter of will and funding and institutional comfort with the subject, all of which remain variable. Meldrum's shelves hold 300 casts. Each one is a fixed record of a moment, a particular morning in a particular forest, a particular impression pressed into a particular patch of soft ground. Whatever made those impressions moved on. The ground was disturbed for a few hours, days at most, before weather and foot traffic began to erase it. The cast preserved one thin slice of the event in plaster, and the event itself moved on into the trees, or down to the river, or wherever the track was going, when whoever found it stopped following and started pouring. That is the nature of the evidence. It is always a record of something that was already gone. The forests themselves are not records. They are living things, still in the full sense of that word, their own processes continuing at the pace forests maintain, whether anyone is paying attention or not. The old-growth stands of the Olympic Peninsula are growing their moss on their own schedule. The Hoa River is moving over its stones at the same pace it moved over them before anyone found the first footprint in the mud beside it. The Six Rivers National Forest, where Bluff Creek runs through its ravines toward the Klamath, is as thick with fir and cedar and alder as it was in October of 1967, denser now in some places where the logged sections have had 60 years to grow back in, quieter in other places where roads that were cut for the timber industry have been decommissioned and reclaimed. The Ouachita Mountains on the Oklahoma-Arkansas border have had their autumn already and are moving toward winter, the oaks gone orange and then bare, the understory thinner now than it was 2 months ago, the ridges visible through the trees in a way they will not be again until spring, and whatever uses the understory for cover, deer, black bear, turkey, the full inventory of what lives in mixed hardwood forest at the edge of the Great Plains, has adjusted to the seasonal change with no awareness that the adjustment is being observed or not observed. The forest does not require attention to continue. It does not require resolution of any question to go on being what it is. What persists in the absence of a definitive answer is a question that has now outlasted most of the people who first asked it in a serious scientific register. John Green, who collected accounts for decades in British Columbia and beyond. Grover Krantz, who built his academic career in part on a serious engagement with the physical evidence. René de Hinden, who spent his adult life in pursuit of confirmation and did not find it. They are gone, and the question they worked on is not. It passed with the files and the casts and the photographs to people like Meldrum and to the researchers at the BFRO and to others working in different institutional settings with different methodologies. And it will pass again to whoever comes after them with whatever tools those people have that are not available now. That is how unresolved questions persist, not through drama, not through conviction, but through the patient accumulation of the kind of attention that can be handed off from one person to the next without losing its quality in the transfer. The plaster casts on the shelf at Idaho State are labeled with locations and years. Some of the years are recent, some of them go back to the 1960s, cast by people who are no longer living, preserved in a medium that does not decay the way paper does, or memory does, or the institutions that held them before they found their way to a university shelf. They will outlast the researchers who made them, as most physical evidence outlasts the people who gathered it. A track cast from the Blue Mountains of Washington, made in a wet autumn some decades ago. A plaster heel, wide and rounded, embedded in the center of a smooth gray rectangle, the ridge detail visible under a loop, or what looks like ridge detail, what careful analysts have argued about without reaching agreement. The cast is still, the argument is still active. The forest where the original impression was made has continued its ordinary processes, the trees adding growth in their slow way, the soil compacting and loosening through 100 cycles of wet and dry. If whatever made the impression is still in that forest, it is moving the way it always has, not in response to the argument, not aware of the loop or the plaster or the shelves at Idaho State, simply moving through the terrain it moves through at the pace and in the manner that suits it.